Okay, so I'll be covering a little bit of a broader topic today. So I wanted to talk today a little bit about the regulation of artificial intelligence in the context of research versus when it's used for diagnosis. So basically the question I'm interested in is, should there be different regulatory standards when algorithms are employed for research purposes? And if so, who can and should verify that they're being employed in a rigorous way versus when algorithms are directly used to diagnose or treat? So as in the case of radiology algorithms, as we'll see. And when I'm talking about regulatory schemes, there are many different ways, obviously, that we can regulate artificial intelligence, as we've seen in other speakers' presentations. But I'm going to mostly talk about regulation in two different contexts. So the first one is privacy, as Dr. Chasang talked about a lot of the automatic decision-making in GDPR, and then two, responsibility and liability when and if something goes wrong. So,
Katerina, sorry, if I may, your
yes.
screen sharing is not the full screen of the PowerPoint. We are currently just seeing your first slide.
I see.
I don't know if that's intentional.
I'm not entirely sure how to fix that. Let me see if I can. Sorry, Emily, I'm not entirely sure if I can. Is it legible? Is the screen legible, or is it?
Yes, so we can just see your first slide right now, but also
Okay.
the rest of the PowerPoint.
Okay.
I'm sending technical assistance your way as we speak.
Okay, thank you.
That's all right. Should be, there we are.
Okay.
Yes, perfect. That's great.
Great. Give me 1 second so that I can actually see my notes at the same time, maybe. Okay, it looks like I'm not able to see my notes at the same time, unfortunately, as when I'm in presentation mode. So if it's okay with you, can you still see the screen?
We can see the first slide, yeah.
The first slide, okay. If it's okay with you, I think maybe it might be easiest for me to proceed this way, just
Sure.
because then I
Whatever
can.
works best for you.
Okay, sorry for that, apologies.
It's all right.
Okay, so we were talking about the two different regulatory contexts that we want to examine. So let's begin by trying to outline what we mean by artificial intelligence. So there are many different definitions, of course, but we're mostly interested in the medical context. So those that don't work in the field or haven't really had much exposure to programming might have in mind these sort of large robots completely autonomously performing surgeries, but that's not really how AI is being implemented in medicine. Right? Really, AI is just a program that's capable of learning. And you may have heard machine learning as a synonym that's been used to describe artificial intelligence. And deep learning is another term. It's a sort of subcategory of machine learning. So how does the program learn, one may ask? So essentially, and as other speakers also have referred to, it's by going through countless iterations of data or inputs and then being trained to recognize patterns or learn answers. At bottom, what these algorithms are just really, really sophisticated pattern recognizers. These systems are currently based on artificial neural networks. That's the kind of state of the art. And they're basically flexible mathematical models using multiple algorithms to identify complex nonlinear relationships within large data sets. And by large, we mean very, very large, not something you could run on a personal computer at home, right? So another obvious question is whether this technology is really new. And the answer is both yes and no. So programmers have been able to make algorithms learn for quite a long time. And the term learn is, of course, subject to interpretation, but these programs have become progressively more sophisticated. But really the big change is in computing power and the availability of extremely large data sets on which to train such algorithms. So in the past, we haven't been able to process the amount of information that's needed for a program to learn and to be able to recognize patterns the way that we are seeing AI being able to do today. So these huge volumes of digitally stored data have permitted the programs to become quite powerful. And we'll see some examples of those. So a good example in medicine are, and you can see some headlines here, are programs that learn to recognize the presence of certain problems like cancers, stroke lesions, ligament injuries, etc. on radiology images. Some of the German speakers might know radiology images as Röntgenbilder. So each algorithm, of course, varies in its complexity and the precise mechanisms by which it is coded to learn. Each algorithm also will be trained on different data sets. So this example, right, these examples, radiology images need to be fed into the algorithm, which helps it to begin to recognize which images show problems or diseases and which images don't. So eventually this program gets really, really good. And as you can see by these headlines, even better than a human at being able to look at, or a doctor specifically, at being able to look at radiology images and detect that there might be a problem, let's say cancer, for example. Of course, now the worry is that we have a program that doctors generally know is statistically better than they are at identifying a cancer, which means that doctors might defer to the machine even though they don't see a problem on a radiology image, or even though there might be a problem just because the program says there isn't one. So this kind of decision would then, even though there is a doctor kind of supervising the robot, would kind of be considered an automated decision, right? Because it's not really honestly being reviewed by a human. The human is deferring to the machine. So what do we do now when the machine makes a mistake? So this is the classic diagnosis problem. This is not the research one. So we're talking about the first category here. So who do we hold responsible if something like this happens? Do we hold the person or the entity that provided the data set to the program that it was trained on? Do we hold the programmer himself or herself responsible? Do we hold the doctor that relied on the program's result without correcting it responsible? Do we apply a quasi kind of tort liability scheme, a product liability one? Do we follow liability schemes that apply to medical devices? So all these questions, we don't really have a great answer for them. Some academics have suggested that we might want to build a sort of insurance fund that all these members or the users of this kind of artificial intelligence could contribute to. And then if something goes wrong, we have a source of money that we can compensate the individual harmed by the AI with, without really having to identify what the precise source of the error was. And again, as other speakers have discussed extensively, oftentimes we won't even be able to identify what the source is, because even the programmers themselves don't really, it's sort of a black box, don't really understand how the AI learned to arrive at the result that it did. So the answers to these questions, as we talked about, haven't really been decided by most countries yet. The other question is, when AI is used for medical diagnosis, is whether and how, so in Europe we have the GDPR, affects when it's used. And the answer is that, of course, it does. So Dr. Chassaing went over Article 2 of the GDPR pretty extensively, which of course gives the data subject the right to be free from automated processing. So in order for either consent needs to occur here, which is one of those exceptions, or we need to have a human reviewing the output of the program. So in the US, on the other hand, the practice of medicine is really regulated generally on a state-by-state basis. So also in the US, we don't really have a consolidated binding law that applies to artificial intelligence or the use of artificial intelligence in medicine. So on the federal level, you do have Hipaa, which is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996. And that regulates data privacy and ownership of medical records. And then you have the Food and Drug Administration, that's a federal agency, and it regulates medical devices, among a variety of other things. So anytime a drug or a medical device becomes available to consumers, first the FDA must approve that drug or device. So the FDA has, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but the FDA has issued guidelines for the use of AI and not yet binding law. The US also doesn't have any laws explicitly addressing the increased use of AI in clinical operations. But again, so we have only one discussion paper from the FDA on this topic so far. The US does have laws that are on the books that address product and professional liability and malpractice, and these will generally apply to artificial intelligence and to, to AI devices, but they don't specifically or explicitly call out AI as a, they don't address it explicitly, right? So how do we answer these questions though if we're actually using AI for research? And when might actually AI be used for research? So a good example that's actually relevant to a European project I'm also working on, Biomap, is the use of AI to sift through large data sets that might include genetic data or symptoms and various other clinical indicators to see whether a correlation might exist between those systems and disease progression or outcomes using genomic data to predict protein structures. So companies like 23andMe, which is a commercial company that allows you to send in saliva samples and receive a report about your health. So specifically the likelihood that you'll develop various diseases, and your genetic heritage, has actually already used its massive database precisely for this purpose. So for example, just this year, 23andMe has used its database to uncover new genetic insights into Parkinson's disease and to discover a genetic relationship between endometriosis and migraine. And it's also used its huge database to identify genetic associations for heart failure. And that's just in 2020, I think. As briefly noted, the US doesn't have an overarching or explicit policy on AI regulation, and this allows 23andMe to do research like this, other than in connection with narrow subjects. So there are exceptions, but not relevant to what we're interested in today. So there are exceptions like autonomous vehicles. The use of artificial intelligence in autonomous vehicles or autonomous weapons does exist, but we don't care about that right now. What the US has done is to issue national and state level national plans, guidelines, or codes, which often highlight essential principles for developing ethical AI. And we talked about that they're not substantive law. So for example, early this year, the White House, specifically the Office of Management and Budget, issued a draft memo where they said this about the use of the regulation of AI in research. Quote, access to data and metadata can facilitate the innovation, design, development, deployment, and operation of specific AI applications. Executive Order 135859, entitled Maintaining American Leadership in Artificial Intelligence, which was signed by Trump in February 2019, calls on agencies to increase public access to government data and models where appropriate. Similarly, California, as early as 2018, unanimously adopted Assembly Concurrent Resolution 215, and that resolution expresses legislative support for using the 23 Asilomar principles as the guiding values for developing AI and of related public policy. So the principles were developed in connection with a 2017 conference in Asilomar, California, where experts from various disciplines met and established the core principles for managing responsible development of AI. As of November 2019, they've been endorsed, the Asilomar principles, by the world's leading AI researchers and leaders like Stephen Hawking and Elon Musk. So this is a very difficult question, right? Should different standards apply to AI when it's used in research versus AI when it's used in a clinical setting or to diagnose? And even when it's used in a clinical setting, it can be used for various different implementations. So it can be used alone, or it can be used with oversight by a doctor. So my personal opinion is that there should be significant differences in the regulation of AI when it's used for research and when it's used for diagnosis. So, for example, a relaxation of the precision with which consent need be given if the data is being reused from a different research project for a new research project could provide AI developers with access to the large data sets that they need to make their algorithms reliable. As we've seen, the larger the data set, the more interesting insights an algorithm could discover potentially. And it's a fundamental step towards making AI work properly in the first instance, right? You need to have the freedom to train it on a variety of different data sets and very large data sets and a variety of different contexts. But the tricky thing will probably be how to define what research really constitutes when we're talking about AI, because you might end up running into, for specific research or specific clinical implementations, a chicken and an egg problem, because the resulting products that you get from trying to train AI will ultimately be themselves used to diagnose. And the FDA has an interesting policy that it's developing that actually kind of may be an interesting guideline in this regard. So the FDA doesn't currently consider all AI programs as medical devices. So programs that analyze large amounts of data to develop knowledge about a disease or condition that are, rather than to decide on a treatment option for an individual patient, may not necessarily be considered as having a medical purpose. And so they may fall under an exception to the definition of medical device by the FDA. So a difference would be, for example, if you're using a lab test, right? That kind of test would be very clearly a medical device. Whereas if you're using something like a radiology image, that might assist in developing knowledge about a disease or condition, but not necessarily be classified ultimately as a medical device, because you always will have that human element, the human oversight. So that's the question I wanted to discuss today, and I'm happy to hear any opinions that the audience might have. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Katerina. I think we'll have a discussion session at the end of all of the presentations.